he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and as was his custom, he stood up to read. And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, and recovery of sight to the blind, and to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." To get the setting of this and to show its applicability for us today, we're going to find that all scripture has applicability for us today. I want to start in Luke chapter 4, verse 14 to put this in context. And we're going to be talking about Jesus announcing his ministry. And he's going to open up the prophet Isaiah, which we just read, and he's going to speak a scripture in his own hometown of Nazareth. Now, prior to going to Nazareth, we read at the beginning he was in Galilee, and he was starting his ministry already in Galilee, and a lot of the people in Galilee were Greeks. People from different seaports were coming in. You had a big diversity of different races and cultures in Galilee. And Jesus was predominantly accepted there without really a problem. And he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. As it was his custom, he entered the synagogue. And you can imagine all of the people in that synagogue probably remembered Jesus as a child. And they probably looked up to him. They probably remembered him as a good child, we would hope, we would think. And Jesus here begins with a scripture from Isaiah that's specifically speaking about the Messiah. And the people in his small town for 400 years, the last prophet was Malachi. So for 400 years, they were waiting for the Messiah. And you can imagine the talks for 400 years in the families. Is the Messiah going to be born through this family genealogy or this family? How is he going to come? So when Jesus is sitting in Nazareth and he begins to read this prophetic messianic text, all the eyes are upon him. And it says that all were speaking well of him in verse 22. And they were probably hoping, could he be the one from our little humble place of Nazareth? Could he actually be the one? So Jesus closes the scroll after he reads it, and all attention is on him. And they were undoubtedly waiting to see if his fame was justified. After all, he was one of them. One of their own, might indeed be one who is a great prophet. Now, what can we learn about this? We can probably imagine that when the Messiah comes, he's going to be like a salesman. He's going to say, "Let me show you what I can do. I can turn water into wine. I can do this. I can do that. I can do this. I can do that." But instead, Jesus just simply gets up and he reads the scripture and humbly goes and he sits back down. And Jesus anticipated their desire for some indisputable miracle, perhaps, that would prove his identity and bring a claim to his hometown. Certainly the temptation to earn their acceptance must have been very strong. But Jesus knew that to do so would have gone against the spirit of his message. And all eyes were upon him. You can imagine that as the apostles later on in Jesus' life began to understand just who he was, they were perhaps watching him a little bit more carefully. How he held a glass of wine, how he used his hands, how he walked, how he talked. Jesus was teaching us everything in everything he did. So what can we learn from his humility in announcing his message? He's the Son of God. He is God in the flesh. And he says, here's Isaiah's text, and he goes and sits down. What can we learn from this? At least me, too often, we may fall into the trap of trying to prove our acceptance at a workplace, or trying to prove that I'm capable of doing this job or I'm capable of doing that. Not with Jesus. His confidence was in God. In responding to his hometown friends, Jesus knew that his first calling was to people everywhere, not just to the exclusive mentality of those of Judea. You can imagine his people, they saw the Gentiles as dirt, as scum. So if he's going to announce that he's the Messiah, he better be on their page. He better be for Judea. He better be for Israel. But what does Jesus begin to do? He begins to talk about Elijah, who provided food for a widow, a Gentile widow named Zarephath in the city of Zion. Then he goes on to talk about Elisha, who healed Gentiles and Syrian Gentiles and lepers. And these Gentiles were outside of the Jewish covenant. They were outside of the promises of Israel. So in announcing his ministry, Jesus is showing that his ministry is quite inclusive. But the hometown folks couldn't stand the thought of being part of God's family along with those dirty Gentiles, those Lebanese and Syrians. They refused to see the need to substitute their privilege of race, fame, favor, faithfulness to God should be their concern. Today we look at messengers that come on our TVs, perhaps politicians and whatnot, and the first thing we do is we want to know what party they're in, this party or that party, instead of listening to what they're saying. Jesus did not want to be a part of this race or this party or this people or that party. Jesus said, listen to what I'm saying. So often, if one doesn't dress, walk, talk, think the same way we do, we ignore them and we become rude. Jesus is telling them that's not how my ministry is going to work. Yes, the people of Nazareth were so inflamed over Jesus' inclusive message of salvation that they herded him to the top of the hill and were ready to throw him bodily over the cliff to his death. So, the reaction of these people right away tells us one thing about the Christian message. Christianity demands a new way of thinking. Christianity demands a new perspective, a new understanding of who is this man, Jesus Christ. In the verses we have just looked at, we see a preview of the overall impact of Jesus' ministry. There were those who heard him gladly, and there were those who turned against him, unwilling to accept the changes of attitude and heart which his words demanded. He goes on to say, truly I say to you, no prophet is welcome in his own hometown. Now we live lost quickly in a small town. Now the Nazarene group, the Nazarenes were not a very big town, and Jesus says, truly I say to you, no prophet is welcome in his own hometown. In all of these experiences Jesus had lived through in the Gospels, as he pronounces his ministry, then starts to live it, we find that through Jesus, he lived through human emotions and testings that are at various times common to people everywhere and to us. He could identify with humanity in these stark moments of suffering, and he could carry into his relationship with people an understanding attitude. He was being rejected by his own folk, his own hometown. He thought, most people think they're going to receive me well. They knew me since I was this tall, they're going to receive me well. But they did not want to receive him. So today, what do we learn from this? We learn that God's truth may come in ways which we do not choose to recognize. God's truth may come in ways which we do not choose to recognize. So Jesus here, after quoting Isaiah, he sits down verse 21, and he began to say to them, today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. So what scripture today is fulfilled in our hearing as we read this? John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever, Gentile or Jew, believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And of course, you and I sitting here are witnesses that those words have been fulfilled in our hearing. So Jesus challenges us this. He gives us an invitation, and then he gives us a commission. Jesus says, come and be healed, go and heal. Come and be called, go and call. Come and hear, go and tell. So as Jesus stood up in the synagogue to profess his calling, his ministry, let us not be ashamed to take the gospel and stand up and share the calling that God has given each and one of us as we go out those doors into the world, hopefully with the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Ending, we will turn to hymn 517, the Lord keep us steadfast in your word.